Okay, welcome to the Executive Speaker Night series brought to you by the Energy Africa Conference, the IB Circle, and Regis University. Today, we are privileged to have Carl Ledbetter as our guest. Carl, good evening. How are you?
Hi there. How are you, Luca? Good to see you again.
Carl, you have had a very interesting career. Can you tell us about which of those components are planned and which components are actually adaptive?
Which ones are which?
Can you tell us about some of the pieces in your career which are adaptive as a result of the environment you found yourself in, or those that were actually planned?
Oh, well, that's easy. There was only one that was planned. I went to graduate school and got a PhD in mathematics and always assumed I would be a professor of mathematics. And so that's what I started out to do. But from then on, every job I ever got, in fact, they're not just different jobs, they're different careers throughout my many decades now doing this, but I never went looking for a job and never interviewed for a job. They just happened to me. So I adapted, I guess, is the answer for all except the first one that I deliberately sought out.
Excellent. Well, nowadays people tend to look at people who are in a particular position for a long time as lacking initiative. In the past, that was a good thing. People saw that as being stable. Now, should we be looking to always move on?
There are two answers to that question, depending on how you intend it. And I think one answer comes from the first remark you made, Luca, and that is that if you're staying in the same job all the time, you're not really learning anything new, you're not really doing anything new, you're not really being challenged to do things in a new way. So in that sense, you should always be looking to move on. But that puts way too much emphasis on the active part of looking. I don't think that you need to be the kind of ambitious that means you're always out looking for your next job. You're always trying to find the next promotion or the next place to go. You should be aware of what's going on in your career and adaptive to what happens in the environment you're working in, and be at least available so that you can do it. But I don't think it does very much good to be constantly on the make, seeking out the next thing that you can do. Pretty much the right job will find you if you are in the right place at the right time and having done the right things to be ready for it when it happens. And you really can't predict what that's going to be. Lives are long and careers are long. I mean, I've often commented about how much things have changed during the time that I've been working. It would have been very difficult for me to predict when I was an undergraduate the way in which the world would be transformed by what's happened in the computer and IT industry with the internet and all the other things that have happened. And the right way to think about these things is to think backwards, to find the analogs that are far enough in the past that we actually can get a picture of them. And I often think about my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was a teenager when the Wright brothers flew and who lived long enough to see men walk on the moon. That's the sweep that happens in a lifetime. And I've actually gone through a similar kind of thing in my career. You can actually see behind me, I just happened to think of it, right behind my left shoulder there, that rectangular thing on the wall is an actual computer board from ENIAC, which was the first electronic digital computer. That is 1 byte. Actually, it's less than a byte. It's what's called a nibble. It's 4 bits of a byte. And it's hanging there on my wall. I got it as an award for winning the Computer Bowl many years ago at the Boston Computer Museum. And that's the kind of computer that we were, well, that I wasn't, but that people were working on when I was born. That board was built when I was 2. And now, of course, we're working in a world where we all have these things, these iPhones. In 1986 and 1989, I was the CEO of a supercomputer company in Minneapolis, Minnesota, called ETA Systems. We had the world's fastest supercomputer at that time. And it ran in, the cycle time for the computer was 1 nanosecond, which would be a cycle time of 1 gigahertz, the way we would talk about it today. The iPhone that I just showed you runs at 3 gigahertz, so it's 3 times as fast. And in order to make that computer run that fast in 1987, when it was first shipped, we put it into something that looked like a hot tub, except that instead of being filled with hot water, it was filled with liquid nitrogen so that we could cool the boards to allow them to run at that speed. And that's not even 40 years ago. So you cannot tell, sitting where you are today, what kinds of opportunities will arise during the course of your lifetime. So you just have to be ready for it. You just have to be constantly aware, not constantly on the make, but constantly available to do the thing that your career takes you to. It's an unpredictable thing.
Interesting. Many people would say that if you don't stay in one position for long, you may lose vision of a serious vision for long-term success. What would be your reaction to that?
Well, what I would tell you is this. I know of almost no successful people who aren't really, really good at something. And I deliberately chose an ambiguous word, something, because it doesn't appear, in my experience, to matter what that thing is that you're really good at. It could be extreme success in sales, it could be something in marketing, it could be talent in the sciences and mathematics and physics and engineering, it could be art, it could be music. And interestingly, it doesn't seem to make very much difference even in business which of those things it is you're very good at. I've actually known people who got their break in business because of something in art or literature or music, as well as the ones who get it from finance or law or accounting or engineering or mathematics or something. What I don't know.
I didn't lie. I was writing fiction with my mouth. Just tell me how much of it.
There we go. What I don't know how to predict for you is which thing it is that you need to be really good at. But what I don't have an example of is somebody who is very, very successful in a business or business related career who didn't have some grounding point that they were truly expert in. It's almost like having a union card. I mean, for me, it was always mathematics and science. And I remember being in one of my first really big engineering management jobs at IBM. And I walked into the room and everybody in the room knew that I had a PhD in mathematics. So they thought that I knew everything they were going to tell me about the engineering they were doing for the software on our project for our vector supercomputer. Of course, I didn't. But that's the point. The point is your expertise buys you a kind of credibility that you are competent enough to figure things out. And so I think what you need to do is specialize early in your career so that you're really good at whatever your chosen main subject is, and then allow your career to take you into places where you get to broaden out and do other things as you go on.
Well, people always talk about mistakes being lessons or opportunities for learning the lessons. Can you have a startup without making mistakes?
How you do what?
Can you have a startup without making mistakes? In other words,
oh no.
Here you have a startup and you're just plain sailing through because of all the lessons you've learned in the past.
No, you cannot possibly do it. In fact, you do learn from the mistakes. I have a grandson who's 12 now, who's very, very good at mathematics, and he gets very frustrated when he can't do a problem right away. He's really quick at these things. So for him, whenever he has a problem, he gets frustrated. And I finally told him one day something that really sort of shocked him. Look, took him back on his heels. I said, when I'm doing a problem in mathematics, which of course is my area of expertise, I'm supposed to be really good at that. People think I just write the answer down. That's not what happens. What happens is that you make a mistake and then you make another mistake, or maybe even worse, you make the same mistake. In fact, I've made the same mistake dozens of times before I finally figure out a way to get past it, even when I'm doing a simple mathematics problem. And that also happens in your career. I'll tell you an interesting story from an early part of my career. I was about 33, something like that. And I was at IBM and I was running a group of 9 people as a manager, first line manager. And one of the things we were doing is we were trying to get the National Science Foundation to name IBM as one of the companies that was going to get one of the national supercomputer centers. There were going to be 4 of them. And they are the 4 supercomputer centers that became the backbone of the internet. So they were at Cornell, University of California, San Diego, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and at Carnegie Mellon. Those were the 4 anchors of the internet when it went live. And we were bidding with Cornell University for one of them. And we were an underdog, believe it or not, at IBM in those days, because Cray Computer was out there. And at that time, in 1982, they had the fastest machine in the world. And so everybody assumed that Cray was going to get the ball, and our job was to try to win one of them. And I was leading the group that was putting this proposal together for IBM. And of course, it was getting attention of the very top management of the company, an opportunity that I had as a first line manager to be going 6, 7 levels over my head to present to the management committee of IBM, the chairman, the CEO, the president, the division heads, and so forth. And just about 2 weeks before that presentation was to occur, when my group was building the presentation for the executive who would be presenting it, who was my boss got promoted to a different job, and I got promoted to his job. So now the presentation that I and my team had been working on for all that time, I was going to be doing the presentation. And of course, I knew it stone cold. I had it all done. So we had 2 more weeks to work on it, and we continued to do it. And the day came and I went to Armonk, the headquarters of IBM, and I gave the presentation, and it went extremely well. And we got the executive committee of the company to sign up to do it. And we later went on and we won the bid, and one of the 4 supercomputers was an IBM machine. But just as we were finishing that and all the big executives were filing out of the place, my big boss, Jack Keeler, who later became president of IBM, at the time he was the group executive underneath the president, said, "Hang on for a minute, Carl." And when everybody was gone, it was just the 2 of us left in this big fancy conference room that the top brass of IBM used. He said, "That was an absolutely great job." He says, "Just an outstanding performance. The proposal was excellent. You got all their questions answered. They're very confident and optimistic." And I said, "Thanks." And I was, sort of basking in the glow. And he said, "And if you ever do that again, I'll fire you." And I went, what is this about? I mean, I sort of really caught me off guard. And he said, "Well," he says, "I put you in this job because you were the best at your job. You were the one who should have gone up to do it. When you were managing this group of 9 people, I saw the work you were doing. It was all great. But when I promoted you, you're now responsible for almost 100 people in 7 or 8 different groups across the company." And he says, "You may have been smart enough to do the work of the 9 people who reported to you in your last job, but no one is smart enough to do the work of 100 people when you're a second line manager." And I never forgot the lesson. The job is different. And so there's a mistake that I made in front of a very, very big boss who became my mentor. And I didn't make the mistake again. So I did continue to do well. But you don't have a way to learn those lessons until you have the experience of doing it. And you'll mess up constantly. The real question is how you recover from the mess up and keep going.
Well, talking about mistakes, what other mistakes have you made, and what lessons did you learn from those mistakes, and how did you go past those mistakes? I know you've just cited one.
Well, the specific mistakes you make are not nearly as significant as the fact that you will make them and you'll have to find a way to recover from them. The first thing you need to do is make sure that you acknowledge the mistake. One of the biggest problems that we see in American business when companies or executives get into trouble is they have something go wrong and they try to cover it up. Covering things up or trying to avoid responsibility for it is literally, it's a permanent fatal death kind of error. You don't ever get out of that. You have to be responsible for what you do or for what members of your team do. One of the things that's very hard to learn if you're going to be in management, if you're going to be an executive rather than an individual contributor of some kind, is that you will get both the credit and the blame for everything that happens in the organization that you run. And so one of the things that you learn is that if you've got somebody in the organization that's causing real grief, you've got to end it. There's a saying that I've come to believe in. It says you never fire a rotten apple too soon. You can't possibly get rid of a poisonous employee fast enough because they'll do damage to other people in your organization, and you may lose people you want to do. The second thing you learn very quickly is, I remember, again, it's the same executive at IBM who I learned this lesson from, Jack Keeler. There was a period of time after the incident I told you about, the supercomputer, when I worked directly for him in a job that IBM called an administrative assistant. It was basically somebody that shadows a very senior executive who's being groomed for a high level job. And during the time I was doing this, Jack hired a new division president, somebody who came in underneath him to do a new job. And a couple months later, that person, his name was Ed Davis, had to make a very key decision. And Keeler knew the decision he wanted. And so he pushed Ed Davis, his subordinate, to make this decision. And finally, Ed accepted that what his boss wanted. And a couple months later, that decision turned out to be exactly right. And there was a big event honoring the success of Ed Davis's division. And I was in the back of the room with Jack Keeler, Ed's boss, while Ed was getting all these accolades for this magnificent decision that he had made, which of course he hadn't made. Jack Keeler had made it. And we were walking back to Jack's office. I said, you were beaming back there while Ed was getting all these attaboys, all these kudos for this decision, but I may be the only other person in the world besides you and Ed who knows that you made that decision and Ed didn't want to do it. And Jack just smiled and shook his head. He says, you just got to learn. When somebody is praising somebody who works for you, they're praising you. Just keep your mouth shut and enjoy the show. So those are the kind of lessons that you learn only by watching the effect. There are an awful lot of people who like to seize credit. They always want to be the person the spotlight is on. They want to have a lot of face time in front of the big boss. That's not the way you do it. The way you do it is very quietly by getting the job done and just doing it well. You may not think it's getting noticed, but I guarantee you if your boss and his boss or her boss is any good, they'll be noticing it. And that's a hard lesson to learn.
Well, still on the concept of, or the topic of lessons, we at Regis University, we pride ourselves in producing MBAs, in producing business graduates. What are the business lessons that you would never learn in a graduate school or in an MBA program?
Well, I just told you one of them, the fact that when somebody is praising the people who work for you, they're praising you. I'll give you another one. Here's one that nobody learns. Everybody has a right to be at least a little bit ambitious, right? Nobody ever gives you anything. So if you're not seeking to do more and to better and to learn and have more responsibility, that's your fault. But you can be too overtly ambitious. And one of the things that I think I see all the time is that people are almost before they get the seat warm in a new job, they're looking for the next one beyond that. But here's something that I notice. You never get promoted by your bosses. You always get elevated by your peers. That's the way the world works. And so all the time and attention you spend trying to be noticed by your bosses is time ill spent. You need to be doing whatever you can to make sure that the people that you work with and who work for you are, that you're helping them get their job done as well. And that's the way you actually move up in organizations. So there's something you don't learn in business school. You almost get taught the opposite. It's not that that an MBA program deliberately teaches you to seek out the next level of responsibility, but it sort of encourages that and uses that as a measure of goodness of your career, when in fact, making sure that all the people who work around you are doing well is the way in fact you get to the front. And I don't think that lesson is very well taught. I would say another one is the thing I mentioned really at the very beginning of this talk, is that it is nearly impossible to get anywhere in business unless you have some area in which you are truly an acknowledged expert. You've got to be good at something. So make sure you spend enough time to be able to say that you are an expert at some field. You may wind up in a completely different field. During my career, I went from mathematics into research and development, and from there into engineering management, and then into P&L management. And I've run everything from finance to had HR organizations reporting to me and so forth. So you won't necessarily always be doing the thing that you're expert at. In fact, these days I look for chances to use my mathematics background, but unless you have it, you won't get there. You won't get to the place where you can make a statement like that. So a lot of people think that the way you get there is by having a really beautifully written resume or something. It's all full of fancy phrases and words, and nothing could be further from the truth. If you're the best resume in the world is one that has as little as possible in it. There's an old joke I used to tell when in fact, at other business schools where I've been there and lecturing in person. I told the story about the three guys in Texas who wind up in a bar, and they're sitting next to each other and they don't know each other, but they find out that they all are landowners in Texas. And one of them says, well, I've got 1 million acres out by San Antonio, and I run 500,000 head of cattle. And he goes on with his resume, and it takes him 15 minutes to finish. And the other two guys are very impressed. This is a serious, powerful rancher. And then the second guy who goes, well, I'm down in by the panhandle up near Amarillo, and I got 2 million acres of land and 1 million head of cattle. And he goes on and gives his whole resume out there. And the other two guys are saying, that's just absolutely great. And then the third guy just doesn't say anything. And they said, well, you're a landowner too? And he goes, yep. He says, well, how many acres do you own? And he goes, 10. Oh, 10 million. Oh, that's a lot of acres. No, it's just 10 acres. And the other two guys are laughing. He says, 10 acres, 10. He says, yeah. He says, whereabout is this gigantic spread? And he goes, downtown Dallas. So there's the issue. You don't really need to say very much if you own 10 acres of downtown Dallas, right? You're successful without having to go into all the detail about how many head of cattle you run and so forth. The best resumes are the ones that said, Nobel Prize, President of the United States. You don't need to put anything else on the resume if you're Obama, right? I mean, that's the resume. Now, and that's an extreme example, but the point is, your career will tell your story by the success of the jobs that you've been in. That's how you tell the story.
Well, let's get down to management, since you've opened the door about how you can make progress within an industry and at work. So my question is, nowadays, as management, the management tends to focus more on short-term goals, because you can see the results, you can see the corporate profits and so on. So you can brag like those two other men that were bragging in a restaurant or in a bar. So given that situation, does that mean that you are actually totally avoiding looking at the long term, because the long term is not going to give you the results that you can show in the short term?
No, I wouldn't say that you have to avoid the long term, but because of the fact that sort of the natural cycle of time you spend in a job is, the 2 to 5 year period. If you can't show some level of success in that period of time, it would be hard to make progress. And so we tend to shorten it up. I do think there's a problem with corporate executives and the public markets in particular going to periods as short as a quarter. But if you explain what you're doing over a longer term, you can still get there. But one of the things that I think is very dangerous about the way we drift in corporate management is, you guys probably teach, the OKR process or key performance indicators or some version of that. What I've learned through making the mistake and getting better at it over time is that it's extremely dangerous to have too many of those. In fact, I have a personal rule that I've come to that I will never have more than 3, and I don't let anybody in any of my organizations have more than 3 key performance indicators and 3 goals, 3 objectives, whatever you call them. And because what happens is this: what if you have 20 objectives and you make most of them, and there are a few of them that you're missing, or you only get 50% credit on, so you get 83% or 87% or 91% of your goal. And the point is, you might as well not have had all those objectives because they didn't really contribute anything. So what I think you need to do is get it down to as few as possible and say it as sharply, as distinctly, and as crisply as possible. One of the very interesting examples of this actually comes out of politics, and I use it just not because it's in business, but because everybody knows it. At his inaugural speech, John Kennedy said that one of the objectives that he had was that within this decade, we would send a man to the moon and return him home safely. There's the objective. One objective, 3 parts, a time, get him to the moon, get him back safely. Unless you do all 3 things, it doesn't matter. And that was it. That was NASA's only objective during the entire time between January of 1961 and July of 1969 when they landed on the moon. Now, for those of you who weren't around at that time, that was a big deal, but you've watched what's happened with the space program since then. The space program has basically had its legs kicked out from under it, and most people can't name practically anything we've done over the intervening literally more than 50 years that have happened since then. And that's because NASA started to have long sets of goals and objectives and complex ways of measuring it. There is an important thing in business, and Luca, this is what you're referring to, having objectives, that you are going to get what you measure. So you had better measure what matters, and you had better not have too many things to measure, because you won't remember what they are. You won't remember what the measurements are. The very best one I've ever seen comes from somebody that I worked with once in my career. We were both at AT&T at the time. We were both division presidents. But he had set this objective for his company when he was the number 2 officer, the president of Federal Express. And he went through one of those, all day, all weekend, come up with the company's overall objectives, its mission statement or something like that. And he hated those things, Jim Barksdale, because they always munged into a bunch of, a paragraph and a half of absolute nothingness, just pablum, utter mush. So Barksdale kept throwing them away until they finally came back with one. And it became what I think is the single best corporate objective I have ever seen. And what's interesting about it is that it has no words and only 8 characters. Federal Express's corporate objective during the years when Jim Barksdale was its president was this: 10:30 a.m. That was the whole thing. And what the reason that's genius is that it made absolutely no difference what job you were in at Federal Express, whether you were the VP of finance or somebody on the loading dock in Memphis where they were loading boxes onto airplanes. You knew what you could do to help the company deliver that package that you had in your hand or whatever it was. You knew what you could do to get all the packages where they were supposed to go by 10:30 a.m. the next morning, and you didn't need to say anything else. That was the time when Federal Express made its bones. That's when Federal Express became a great company. It's the simplicity of the vision. It's the notion that you put all the wood behind one arrowhead. Now, if you name the wrong objective, you're dead, right? You don't succeed. So you really do have to measure what matters and make the measurement simple and one that everybody can understand.
Well, when you talk about short-term needs versus long-term needs, how do you balance the pressures of short-term needs and long-term vision?
Well, it depends on the situation you find yourself in. The example that I sometimes give is, my wife is a doctor, and I think I saw Pius come out here earlier. There he is. He's up there. He's a surgeon. So all doctors have they have a way of thinking about this that I think is very instructive. It's called triage. If suppose you have a patient who gets wheeled into the emergency room and he has a compound fracture of the femur and a knife sticking out of his side and a sucking chest wound from a gunshot in the chest and a hangnail, you can pretty much forget about the hangnail. You don't need to treat the hangnail. You need to treat the things that are going to kill the patient first. When I took over a division at AT&T many years ago now,
I'll put my headphones on.
the division had lost $538 million in the previous year, and I came in to take it over, and it was in trouble. I mean, $538 million is a lot of money, even for a big company like AT&T. And I made 4 decisions, just 4 decisions that utterly changed the business. And we went from losing more than $500 million to making almost $500 million in 1 year. So I swung AT&T's bottom line by $1 billion in 1 year, and that was about 1/4 of AT&T's total profits that year. And one of those decisions, the most controversial one, was we were at the time making telephones. These were not cell phones, not what we use today, but they were wireless telephones that were connected to base stations in your house and then went out on the line from there. Many of you probably are too young to even remember those stations, but in the early days, there was only 1 channel, and then we went to 2 channels, and then we went to 10, and then we went to 25, but AT&T was still selling one that had only 2 channels. And it was the #1 selling product of AT&T, with AT&T's largest customer for handsets, Sears at Roebuck, at the time. That tells you how long ago it was, right? But one of the things that I did is I had our accounting department do an analysis of all of our phones, and the analysis came back that said we were losing money on every 2-channel phone we sold. And the reason we were losing money is that people would buy the phone because it was the least expensive of AT&T's wireless phones. But with only 2 channels and with more and more people having these phones, you were getting interference from the garage door opener across the street and from somebody else's phone down the block and so forth. So people brought them back because they wouldn't stay connected. And so we had to absorb all the cost of the returns and the refurbishment and all of that stuff. So we were losing money on all the phones. So I said, we're going to kill that whole SKU. We're going to kill the whole product line of all the 2-channel phones that AT&T makes. And the guy who ran my sales organization for me said, you're going to kill me. He says, Sears is our biggest customer, and this is the biggest product we sell to them. And we're going to get ruined by this. And he literally fought me tooth and nail on it. And I finally had to take him out of the job in order to get it done. And I flew out myself and had a meeting with the CEO of Sears to talk about killing the 2-channel phones. And when I was all done, I waited for his reaction. And he said, thank you. Thank you. He says, those 2-channel phones are killing Sears. We buy them from you because you're our biggest supplier for electronics, and we didn't want to disappoint you. And we had a great relationship with your sales management and so forth. But we don't want those phones. We don't like it when customers bring back phones that don't work well because it reflects badly on Sears. So to make a long story short, what looked like a disastrous decision in the short term turned out to be a brilliant decision in the long term. We did have a 1-quarter dip in sales at Sears where we figured out how to change all the displays and all the end caps and how they got their act together to sell only the higher end models of the phone. And within 6 months, we were back way above the level we were before. We reduced the total cost of refurbishment of the phones that were returned, and it turned out to be a good decision. So there's one where not even the long term, just looking at the medium term, making a decision that stopped the bleeding, sort of the triage of let's get rid of the products that are losing money for us right now. We don't know what we're going to replace it with yet, but we have to stop the bleeding so that we can buy ourselves more time. And I think a lot of business managers are afraid of doing that. Here's an interesting business lesson. Since we're talking about these kinds of things, the difference between short-term and long-term. There are very few companies that see the upstarts coming with a technology that's going to completely unseat them, that's going to roll over the top of their business and destroy them. Companies like Sears, who didn't see companies like Amazon coming. But there are a handful of prominent companies, 3 of them in particular, that were giant, successful companies with one technology base who lived through a transition to another technology base that was going to utterly destroy their old business and come out on the other side of it as a great company in the new technology. And those 3 companies are IBM, Motorola, and NCR. NCR is now NCR, but that used to stand for National Cash Register. IBM was a great company in the business machine era. They did adding machines and collating machines and card sorters and things like that. And they made the transition to the computer age in the 1960s. Motorola was a company that was a military radio contractor. They made walkie-talkies and other radio gear for the United States Army in World War II, and they made the transition to being a semiconductor company and then into the telephone business and other high-end electronics. And NCR went from mechanical cash registers to being the #1 vendor of the machines that you use at point of sale, like ATM machines and cash registers in grocery stores and places like that. And what's really interesting, talking about the short-term, long-term focus, you need to have long-term focus to be able to make a transition like that. You know what is common to those 3 companies and the transition they made from the old technology to the new technology? And it's a shocking insight. And then when I explain what I think the insight means, you'll understand the point of Luca's question. The insight is that in each of those 3 companies, the person who was the head of the group that was promoting and sponsoring the new technology that was going to take the company in a new direction was the actual son of the CEO. Now, that's a strange thing, isn't it? So what is the explanation for that? The explanation for that is that in every company that's going through that kind of a transition, the young Turks who come up and have the new idea, they're consuming money in R&D and marketing and all the other things that you need to do it. And the old guard says, well, who are these whippersnappers? You know, we've been building this company, and the company is living off of the things that we did when we were in our 30s and 40s. And now these young whippersnappers want to take our cash and do something else with it and lose money for 4 years. And they kill them. Basically, the antibodies inside the corporation destroy the upstarts who are going to modify the business. And the only antidote against that is to have the person who's heading the division be the son of the CEO at the time, because nobody wants to attack the CEO's kid, right? Now, that's not a very good strategy in the long run for most companies. So what can you do to institutionalize the way that works? And the answer is in the United States, we found a way to do that. We found it starting in the late 1950s and the early 1960s when the venture capital industry rose up. Venture capital industry makes investments in upstart companies, most of which fail, and they fail quickly. In fact, if you look at even very successful venture capitalists, 75% of all Series A deals do not make money. And 49% of all Series A deals lose every dime. And that's with people who know what they're doing. So how can that be a good business model? And the answer is because the ones that do make it, the 25% that return at least the amount that's invested, and of that, the 10% that make at least 2x, and of that, the 5% that make at least 5x, 10x, sorry. And then there are a couple of percent that make gigantic returns. That's the son of the CEO. That's the place where by putting investment into something that doesn't have to protect itself against the antibodies of the old guard, the company just explodes out of nowhere and becomes a phenomenon overnight. That's what happened with Microsoft, and it's what happened with Google, and it's what happened with Amazon, it's what happened with Facebook, it's what happened with Cloudflare, it's what happened with almost every company that utterly revolutionizes things. They see a new thing, they make short-term decisions that lose money, but in the long term, they completely upend a market. And that's the balance you have to keep.
Well, Carl, you, in one of your lives, so to speak, you were also a venture capitalist, which I assume you still are. How do you go about picking the winners and losers?
Well, as I said, there's no formula. You know, the venture capital industry is one where if you're wrong half the time, you're a genius. In any other kind of giant corporate environment, if you're wrong half the time, you're an idiot and you don't keep your job. So yeah, it's hard. The one thing that I tried to do, it's sort of related to my be really, really good at something. I had a rule, and the rule for us when I was managing partner of the venture capital firm, Pelion Venture Partners, was that we would never make an investment in a technology that didn't work. That sounds trivial, but a lot of technologies just don't work. That you think they're going to work. They're all gung-ho about them, but they don't know enough physics, or they don't understand how hard it is to get radio signals through a noisy atmosphere. Who knows what it is? There are all kinds of things so I never wanted to make a decision to put money in a company where the technology didn't work. That by itself is not sufficient to win. You have things go wrong. We made 2 investments, believe it, we made 115 investments on my watch there, but we made 2 investments in companies where within 6 months, the founder had died of cancer, undiagnosed at the time we made the investment. You just can't do anything about those kinds of issues. And we also made decisions to invest in companies where the technology worked fine and it just wasn't enough to break through in a market because you need something else to go with it, or the customers didn't like it that way. Now, I'm not saying that you should make only safe investments where you can describe what what the customer's like. Yeah, Steve Jobs had a great line. He said, "Don't ask the users what they want. They don't know." Right? They don't know what they want. You don't know what you want until you see it working. But one of the things that I would say is that almost all technologies that really revolutionize things, the one that give you 100-to-1 returns, are ones that cause people to do things in a different way. The canonical example that I used to use was people used to go to the movies and buy hot dog and popcorn and a Coke. Now they order Netflix and have a pizza delivered to the door. It's the same business. It's the same model, but it happens in a different place. It's more comfortable. It's in your house. You can start and stop the movie when you want. You can get a pizza instead of a hot dog, whatever it is. There's always a repurposing. One of the things that you have to remember is that there is no money in the world which isn't being used. That's an odd thing to say, but there's no unemployed money, let's put it that way. Even if what you do is you put the money under your mattress, you're using it for something. You're using it because it makes you feel comfortable that you have a little bit of you have a go bag under your bed or whatever it is. Every dollar in the world, in every currency in the world, is actually being employed for a reason that its owner wants to employ it. So the most important thing you can put on your business plan is not totally available market. It's what person is going to take some money that they're currently using for something else and give it to you instead for your new product. That's the most important business question there is, because that money is already designated to go someplace by your customer, your potential customer. So you have to tell me what customer it is that's going to stop spending money on one thing and start spending it on you, and why.
Carl, you do have some patents. What drove you into discovering those patents? What attracted you to the idea?
Well, the patent system is very old. It dates all the way back to the early days of the country, and it is an attempt to strike a balance between avoiding the market failure of scarcity control, monopoly, and allowing people to profit from their inventions without having somebody else steal their idea. So it's a conflict between allowing people to use what they invent for themselves and giving them enough time to do it without allowing them to monopolize and freeze markets behind them. And so when I discovered some new things in several different areas in my career, I filed patents to ensure that I'd have the ability to have enough time to work it out. But I have noticed something really interesting about patents that has a business implication. It'd be interesting to hear those of you who come out of the medical field and your reaction to this as compared to those who come out of the engineering field. But when I took over as the managing partner in my venture firm, we had a couple of partners who did investments in medical device technology, and the rest of them were all in software and infrastructure. And I noticed within the first few months a very big difference between people in the software and telecommunications industry and people in the medical device and drugs industry. And the difference is in the software and telecommunications industry, all the entrepreneurs were doing this full time. This was their job, and it was the only thing they did. It was the only way they could make money. Their mortgage depended on it. And there were very few patents. Basically, you stayed in front by staying in front. You just had to run faster than everybody else. In the medical device and therapeutics industry, everybody had patents, and the people who wrote the patents were usually professors at medical schools, or they were practicing physicians in some specialty, and they didn't quit their jobs. They kept making their living as physicians, and then they hired people to run the business. But notice then the person who is the inventor doesn't have his mortgage or her mortgage depend on the result of the business. And there's an old Ben Jonson saying that the knowledge that you'll be hanged in a fortnight concentrates the mind wonderfully. The idea in the software industry in particular is that you can't really patent things for a very long period of time, right? People can read the patents, they can figure out a way around it. So you had better be running. But in the medical industry, you have this enormous, elaborate infrastructure built up, even with drugs. As soon as the patent comes near to running out on a drug, they build the left-handed polymer of the drug and they extend the patent for 18 more years. So, and people who are doing this don't depend on the success of the business for their livelihood. They have a larger infrastructure, or a company that surrounds them, and they work for a hospital and they have the rest of their career. So in some ways, it's better to be exposed to the whims of the market. In fact, one of the things, and talk about a real lesson, Luca, about the way business works, I've talked about how important it is to be really good at something, to be an expert, but you don't get paid for that expertise, not really. What you get paid for is taking a managed risk. The market pays for successfully undertaking a risk, not for being the world's greatest accountant. I had a lawyer who worked for me once in one of my startups, and he was at the end of his career, and he was retiring, and he said, if I had it to do over again, I'd do what you're doing. And I said, why? And I said, you've done great as a lawyer. He worked for one of the biggest, most successful firms in the Valley, Fenwick and West. And he goes, yeah. He says, but all I ever did was sell my time. And my time got slightly more expensive as I got older and more experience. But I still was selling my time, and there was only so much of it. He says, what you do is you invent stuff, and then that stuff makes money by itself. Once it's out there, it makes money by itself. And so it's the acceptance of the risk that you could fail, and the upside that if you are successful, the thing will make money by itself. That's what the market pays for.
Well, on that note, we do teach our students that running a business involves managing things and assessing the risks and understanding the risk and how you can somehow try to mitigate that risk. What is your view on that?
Well, as I said, that is the whole thing. What risks should you accept? I always tell people the market pays for risk, but it doesn't pay for stupid risk. It doesn't pay for Russian roulette. There's a French economist who once made the observation that in the United States, we have a real problem with gambling. And he didn't mean Las Vegas. He meant lotteries. He meant the way we fund education in the United States pretty much is with state lotteries and so forth. He says, how come in the United States you don't teach your students that lotteries are a tax on stupidity? So there's a risk you shouldn't take. It's not that you can't win. It's just that the risk-reward relationship is in the wrong direction. So you should take risks that you can undertake with a reasonable chance of success and something other than catastrophic failure if you don't make it, that you can move on to do the next thing, or you have enough resources left over to try again. To do anything other than that is just desperation, and it doesn't work out well for most people. So I think that the way to do that is to try to find some methodology that assesses what the level of risk is and what the ratio of the reward to the downside is.
Actually, building up on that, how do you know you've actually covered enough scope to minimize your risk?
How do I know if I have enough?
If you covered enough enough scope of the risk or
Yeah, you
what is
don't know.
associated with the, sorry, go ahead.
You don't know. The American General George Patton said a good decision made now is much better than the perfect decision made in 2 days. You have to make a decision and move on, and you shouldn't spend a lot of time looking back, second guessing yourself. You should admit it when you're wrong and try to fix it, but you shouldn't spend a lot of time agonizing about it. You just need to learn to do that work, and there's no formula for it. That's the art.
I understand. Now, given the fact that you've talked about being an entrepreneur, doing things, I would like to know, how do you go about attracting investors so that at least you can get lucky, so to speak, and when good things are happening, you are there as well?
How you attract investors?
Mm-hmm.
You tell the story. You tell the story of what it will be like if you're successful, and you weave into it the evidence that you have a better chance of success than not. And you do it in a way that's entertaining. I have a sort of a little secret in my life. My father was a minister, a preacher. Didn't take with me. I came out the other end of the spectrum, but I watched my father preach 3 times a week for all of my life until I left for college. And one of the things that my father did that was different in the pulpit was this. He was not only a preacher, he was a member of the American Society of Professional Magicians. And what he did is, in every sermon he ever preached, someplace in the sermon, could it be at the beginning, it could be at the end, could be in the middle, but someplace in the sermon, he did a magic trick which illustrated the point of the thing that he was doing. And he was a scholar. He spoke ancient Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew, and he would do these sermons on interpreting scripture based on what the words were in the original language, and these complex things on church history. And these are dry, difficult subjects, but my father did it as the storyteller. And he did it by illustrating his point with a magic trick someplace in the sermon. So people hung on their seats for my father's magic trick. Now I do something very different. It couldn't be very, very much further away from religion than mathematics. But mathematics is a dry and a difficult subject too. And nobody wants to know all the details of why 280 nanometer waves bounce off of these things and are absorbed by these things. That's not going to be something that's interesting for most people. But if you can weave that into a story where you tell them how it's going to make a difference for them. When I'm talking about the problems of computer arithmetic, I do it by telling stories about baseball, about the fact that as a 9-year-old kid, I calculated the batting averages of every player in the American League out of the box scores in the newspaper every morning and kept them on 5x7 index cards. And it's a funny story because you can imagine this 9-year-old with a pencil, doing arithmetic and on a sheet of paper. But it's a story about the way computers do arithmetic. So you have to make it interesting for people. People have to want you to win, not because they want to make money in the investment, but because they want to be associated with your company.
Thank you very much, Carl. On that note, we would like to call it a day. I promise I would keep you here for 59 minutes, and I'm right on to it with some 30 seconds to spare. Thank you very much, Carl. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. My sense is you could have been doing some more enterprising stuff.
Oh, this was fun. I enjoyed doing this. I've never completely stopped being a teacher. And so this was very enjoyable, Luca, and I hope someday we can do it in person again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.